So, and I'm going to try to make sure I leave plenty of time. We have a very experienced panel here. I spend a lot of time talking about. I want to make sure we open it up to you folks as well. But let me get started. I think Scott, obviously, having just come from working with Secretary Carson, everyone, I know I am, is anxious to hear your perspective on what do you think that his priority is going to be as HUD Secretary. And I guess obviously the budget came out yesterday. How do you see his priorities as you see them lining up with what that budget's telling us?
Right, thank you. And first, thank you to the foundation. Thanks for inviting me. I really appreciate that time. When they asked me a few weeks ago to do this, I knew that the budget was coming out on the 16th. So I said, what date was that again? So I thought that would be, well, that's going to be a lot of fun. So yes, the budget came out, and I think we can get into that. I did one of these panels yesterday, and the panelists ended up talking about themselves for so long, we never even got a chance to really get to the questions. So I'll try to be brief. I met Dr. Carson for the first time back in December. The Trump administration, the Trump transition team asked me to take the helm of that transition effort because I spent a lot of time at HUD, and I've been using HUD programs for many years. If you don't count when I was a kid building pools for my dad and doing work on the job sites, I've been in housing now for almost 17 years. And that's probably pretty young when you look at some of the other great housing policy folks. Sean obviously has been in a lot longer than that. And I've worked with Sean in the past, and before going into the Bush administration, I actually reported to a lady named Valerie Jarrett when we worked on issues in Chicago together. So I've covered the waterfront, and I've covered the nation in all kinds of housing policy. I don't think I'm quite at $1 billion worth of D4 production, but I use the D4 product very, very regularly. The 221 D4, the senior housing projects, the programs, the 232 programs, and the 242 programs. So they said, look, you've got a great background in this. We really want you to, you understand the operations of HUD and how to do this. We'd really like for you to help Dr. Carson move through this process. And we had not met before then. And when I got to know Dr. Carson, and we met, I think, December 7th for the first time, and I saw a guy who really cares. He has an incredible personal story, and it is a real personal story. I mean, he truly did. It wasn't, there's a lot of stories about he grew up in public housing. He did not grow up in public housing. He grew up in GI housing. It was 750 square feet, a very small house in Detroit. But to him, it was a castle. I mean, his parents got divorced when he was 8 years old. He moved to Boston, right? And he didn't have a place to call home. He was shuttled from different relatives. And so he talked a lot about being housing insecure. And that's a term that's relatively new, and I think it's a really good way to characterize this. And that housing insecurity really developed a firm understanding for him about what it is to really care from the heart. I think as you kind of go through this, and I look at this budget, and look, this budget, Dr. Carson wasn't confirmed until March 2nd. The blueprint for this budget was created back in January. He had very, very little to do with this. This is a budget that really holds as a priority, looking at the fact that as a country we owe $20 trillion in debt, and it says, where do we start when we want to deal with that $20 trillion? And that's a real number. I mean, back when I was at HUD, we dealt with about $6 trillion, and that's a small period of time to really grow so much. Now, the question I'm sure that my friend to the right will say quickly is, okay, we owe $20 trillion. Should we pay it all back from HUD? And that's a great question. I think that's a question that will play itself out. I think Sean did a great job last night of really talking about this budget is really a marker. It's not going to happen. It's not going, you talk with Senator Collins. One of the things, too, I wanted to do is make sure that as pressed, you know who to look to and who to watch inside the Congress about who the folks are that are going to really make these decisions. Senator Collins from up in Maine, a big proponent of the CDBG program. She would not let this budget stand. Congressman Diaz-Balart down in Miami, he is the chairman of the House Appropriations Committee. He loves the home program. The home program, he's not going to let this budget go as is. So this is a kind of a marker place. Now, when it comes to Dr. Carson, I think what his idea, if he could do whatever he wanted to do, of course, he is selected. The president was elected, and so he will work through that process. But I think what he wanted to do, what he would like to do, is go around the country and see what programs work. I think Chris did a great job of saying there's a lot of stuff out there, and there's a lot of policies out there, and trying to find that common theme, that kind of find that common arc that we can develop good policy, good consistent policy is so difficult. And that's why as you're looking at whether or not you want to become a housing beat reporter, this is complicated stuff because you can't get to a soundbite this difficult issue. Last night, I was really, I kind of, now I get to just be a spectator. But when you look at CDBG and Meals on Wheels is such an infinitesimal piece of CDBG. But what was it that caught the nation's attention on the cuts? It was not housing, it was Meals on Wheels. And if you showed me 10 communities that actually use CDBG for Meals on Wheels, I would be shocked. It's probably a handful. But that's what got everybody focused on these cuts inside CDBG or inside HUD. So I think what Dr. Carson would want to do is go across the country, find out the things that are working, find those things that aren't working, highlight those things that are, and try to figure out how can we make them work better. I think that Sean also made a great comment last night, and Anne-Marie said we should have had you guys up there together. I would love to have done it because I probably would have a different answer for some of those questions, but a lot of them we would actually have the same answer. And it is building on some of those initiatives that started under President Bush, the Interagency Council on Homelessness. That was actually started back under Secretary Kemp, kind of waned during the Cuomo administration, and then Secretary Martinez kind of fired it back up and said, let's kind of really holistically focus on this. And then going into President Obama, I think you've seen great progress. I think what Dr. Carson would like to do, though, is take that interagency council experience and pivot now to poverty in general, and using that as a platform to aggregate all the secretaries who touch poverty, touch these issues. Education, labor, justice. And justice is a big issue for Dr. Carson because what he sees is sentencing reform. And the fact that when you get a youth who is charged with probably 17 different issues, he only gets maybe convicted of one and probably gets plead down, but that youth now has that entire rap sheet, that all of that is still on his record. And that's really hard for that youth to actually go out there and find a job. So, these are all issues that transcend just HUD and try to look at the community as a whole and holistically. I think that's really where Dr. Carson would want to be. He feels very passionately about the health aspects of housing, the intersection of health and housing. I think that one of the things that the budget did do yesterday was say that there's more money going into lead. I think that CDBG also does a lot of that, so you need to really look at both CDBG and the lead programs for HUD. But I think that's an area where he will absolutely focus. I think he likes the concept of public-private partnerships, and I think he's very passionate about LIHTC. He spent a lot of time in Baltimore with a guy named Bart Harvey. Bart Harvey, if you're in housing, is one of the people who is remarkable, actually, and it's a great timing to have this conference because 2 days ago was the 31st anniversary of the low-income housing tax credit, that 1986 Tax Act. And we haven't really touched taxes since 1986. You think about that, and we're on the precipice now of trying to do something like that. But Bart worked very closely with Senator Packwood and Dan Rostenkowski on developing that low-income housing tax credit that really is such a production tool. Now, it's over at Treasury, but it works so well with HUD and the HUD programs. So before I keep going, I'm going to stop there and just make sure I'm available to answer questions. But I think overall what you will see is a lot of continuation of where HUD is. It is so hard to turn the agency, but trying to find where programs can be, some of the barriers are real. And it's not just an easy answer to say, well, let's just remove these barriers. There's a lot of barriers to affordability. There's a lot of barriers to housing. Well, there really are. And it's not things like the affirmatively furthering fair housing rule. That's not, Dr. Carson was very clear that the Fair Housing Act is not something he is interested in going out there and changing. He believes strongly in it. I think when you look at the affirmatively furthering fair housing tool, that there is a lot of ambiguity in that rule, and I think there's a lot of disagreement even inside the HUD building about what that rule says. So I think trying to find consistency and trying to find sort of bright lines so that you don't have mayors who, when they think of housing, think only of, oh my gosh, litigation. And I think that's a really big issue. So trying to find those things, little things like environmental, right? Not environmental as in let's go out there and pollute our waterways, but environmental as in noise pollution. If you want to go out there and you want to do what a lot of people in this room say they want to do, they want to go out there and try to urban infill. They want to try to build multifamily housing inside urban areas close to transportation. Well, if you're close to transportation, you may be close to a train. Trains make noise. And HUD, for the last 2 years, has taken the position of that if the noise is over a certain decibel, then you can't build balconies to your multifamily housing. It becomes a big deal and very difficult because developers are trying to go out there and get people to come in and try to find that market spectrum that they can find those rents that are both affordable and actually make that capital stack work. So, and I know Ingrid probably knows more about that than I do, but with that, I'll leave it there and we'll come back and I'm sure there'll be lots of questions.
All right. Thank you, Scott. So Diane, I want to give you a chance too. Obviously, big changes in Washington with the Trump administration coming in, and from where you sit, I guess, what do you see as the real both threats and the opportunities going forward to advance the issues that you care about? And what are your plans to move that agenda?
Sure, thanks. Thanks for the opportunity to be here today. And related to the threats, of which there are many, and I'll talk specifically about some of them. Some people have asked what happened to my foot. It's a stress fracture, which seems appropriate. So just, the most immediate threat, I think, to housing programs for the lowest income people is the budget proposal that came out yesterday. And just to respond to a couple of things that Scott said, one is that this budget has nothing to do with reducing the deficit. And that's obvious because the cuts in the non-defense discretionary side of the budget are met with increases on the defense side of the budget. So we're not cutting costs anywhere here. We're prioritizing what we should be spending money on. So what that looks like is, first, we are under a continuing resolution in the current fiscal year. The continuing resolution goes through the end of April for FY17. And just to keep the current HUD programs running at their current levels, keeping the roofs over the same amounts of seniors, people with disabilities, families with kids' heads, requires inflationary cost increases every year. So the longer the continuing resolution goes on for FY17, the greater the risk of losing some of those resources, starting to lose some of those Section 8 vouchers. One detail of yesterday's budget proposal that came out that hasn't been focused on yet is that the Trump administration is also proposing for FY17, the year that we're in right now, is to increase defense spending by $30 billion and to take $15 billion of that out of the non-defense spending. So that's a place where now for FY17, we see the threats ahead of some cuts to these programs. A best case scenario for FY17 would be that we end up with a full year continuing resolution at current funding levels. And that best case scenario means taking a step backwards in terms of who's assisted and how. The worst case scenario, obviously, is some cuts to those programs. Then the FY18 budget proposal out of this administration has extreme cuts across the entire social safety net, and specifically within housing and community development programs, they say it's a 13% cut, about $6.2 billion. That is based off of FY16 levels. If you consider the costs necessary in the FY17 levels, the cuts are actually more like 15%, closer to $7.5 billion in 1 year from the Department of Housing and Urban Development. So what that means is some of these major block grant programs like the CDBG program, the Home Investments Partnership Program, both of which provide flexible funding to local communities to meet a variety of needs, to revitalize distressed communities, to provide services like Meals on Wheels and other services to seniors and other vulnerable populations, and to provide gap financing for affordable housing deals to be possible through the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Program. So those are eliminated entirely. And still, because when you look at the overall HUD budget, 85% of it is made up by those costs to the programs that are, again, just keeping roofs over people's heads. Those are the major housing subsidy programs. So outside of that 85% is those major block grant programs. So you eliminate those, and then you don't really have any other place to go than starting to cut into these programs that are housing vulnerable people. And in the budget proposal we saw yesterday, there's this sort of unnamed about $3.5 billion worth of cuts. There's a suggestion that those cuts will be made through efficiencies in programs. And I can assure you that while we can certainly improve program administration, we can find cost-efficient ways to run these programs more efficiently, we can find cost savings, you can't begin to come up with $3.5 billion in cost savings through efficiencies to these programs. And we know through the leaked budget that Jose and his reporting revealed that we saw a little bit more of the detail about where those cuts may come from. Very likely some significant cuts to the Section 8 voucher program, significant cuts to the public housing program, and others. On the Section 8 voucher program alone, what that would mean is about 200,000 families, seniors, people with disabilities who have housing assistance today would be at risk immediately of losing that assistance. And then, of course, they would have a difficult time paying their rent, and they'd be at increased risk of eviction and potentially homelessness. So some very significant threats in this budget. And while it's certainly true that this year more than ever, maybe, this budget proposal is dead on arrival in Congress, and that we're seeing Republicans and Democrats really very cool reception to this and distancing themselves from it. We have to take it seriously as a showing of what this administration's priorities are for housing and the entire social safety net. And we also have to be careful of the administration sort of moving the goalposts so far that if we end up with only half as much cuts, that people somehow feel satisfied. And that will still be devastating, not just to the programs, right, but to the people that they serve and to the millions more who are in need of assistance and not getting any. So the budget proposal is really the most immediate and the most significant threat. There are other threats to the National Housing Trust Fund program, which is a new program that was created in 2008. Just last year got its first funding allocation. It's the first new funding for housing for the lowest income people in 30 years. And it's to develop and preserve rehab rental homes for extremely low-income households. So last year's funding allocation was $176 million nationally. This year it'll be about $220 million. It's a drop in the bucket compared to the need, but it's an important resource and an important step forward in starting to meet that unmet need. It's threatened in several ways this year. One is just by virtue of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac continuing to be in conservatorship. And by design, their capital buffers are declining and will be down to zero around this time next year. What that means is that every quarter there's an increased risk of the need for a draw from the Treasury. And when there is that draw, the contributions to the National Housing Trust Fund are suspended for an unknown amount of time. So the longer we go without comprehensive GSE reform, the greater the threat to the National Housing Trust Fund program. There's an opportunity there as well when Congress does address Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and start to move towards comprehensive GSE reform. There's a significant opportunity to increase the resources to the trust fund, but it's unclear when we'll get there and how we'll get there. The other threat to the trust fund is an appropriations threat. A couple of years ago, when there were also tight budget caps, there were proposed cuts to the home program, and in the House Appropriations Committee, they suggested sweeping the trust fund dollars and using it to plug the hole in the Appropriations Committee. That was defeated then, but we'll have to look out for that kind of a temptation again this year, especially with the budget hole being so significant. And the final threat is just kind of existential, where there are some conservative Republicans in the House who have sought for many years to eliminate the program altogether. A third major threat is to the low-income housing tax credit program through comprehensive tax reform and the administration and Congress's desire to use comprehensive tax reform to significantly lower corporate tax rates. and to do it in a deficit neutral way. The only way you do that is by eliminating or reducing expenditures, of which the low-income housing tax credit is one. The housing credit is certainly enjoys really strong bipartisan support, and so I think it's in a strong position, but we have to certainly be very careful to make sure that that vital resource is protected in comprehensive tax reform. So really the full array of affordable housing and community development programs are threatened significantly right now. One opportunity related to tax reform is to reform the mortgage interest deduction. It sounds like you talked a little bit about that yesterday, but unlike for many, many years, the mortgage interest deduction is being considered actively for reform. Some key Republicans in the White House, in the House and the Senate are looking at ways to change it. That's an opportunity for us to work towards making sure that those reforms make the mortgage interest deduction more useful to those lower and middle income homeowners who couldn't otherwise become homeowners and could save really significant money that could be reinvested in rental assistance programs. And then the final threat that I'll just mention briefly is around fair housing and the progress that we've made in recent years where under the Obama administration, for the first time since 1968 when the law was passed, communities got some useful guidance and tools to enable them to meet their obligations to further fair housing. And those are certainly threatened by, I'd say to some degree by the administration, but much more through Congress. There have been a lot of attempts by conservative Republicans in the House and the Senate to eliminate the fair housing rule and really take a big step back in the progress we've been able to make towards creating inclusive communities.
Great, Diane. You've queued up a lot of issues for us that I'm sure we'll come back to. Certainly a long list of threats. I wish the list of opportunities were longer, but maybe Mike can point to some of those. Now, I think of Mike in recent years as doing a lot of work around mortgage finance reform, but he's also very thoughtful and written a blog recently for the Bipartisan Policy Center around rental affordable housing priorities and what they ought to be in a bipartisan fashion. So I thought maybe, Mike, you could describe to us those ideas you laid out in that blog, particularly around that.
Sure. Just a couple of points on the budget. I don't know that I disagree with anything that Diane has talked about, but one of the things to really appreciate in the kind of context is the budget caps that we've been working on under sequester, where the sequestration rate was supposed to be so bad that it would force the grand bargain and a budget settlement that never happened. And so those budget caps have been extraordinarily tight. And one of the things, I left the administration in March of 2016, and one of the things that the administration was able to do was to make an agreement with the appropriators around the concept of parity. That if we're going to break the caps, because you need more money on defense, then the president insisted that for every $1 increase in defense, we would get a $1 increase in the domestic discretionary budget. And even though those caps were tight and it constrained both defense and non-defense discretionary, that parity was maintained. And that parity, that principle of parity is gone. And the $54 billion buildup, right, in the defense discretionary budget, right, all will be offset by the $54 billion equal cut on the discretionary non-defense side, which the entire burden of paying for that buildup in defense comes on the small 15% of the budget that is non-defense discretionary, which is really seriously problematic. But in addition to eliminating CDBG and home, there are other programs wiped out, zeroed out at HUD that are smaller that are really, really important. The budget zeroes out, and many of you in your local communities may be familiar with NeighborWorks affiliates across the country that have really worked with families to prevent foreclosure, housing counseling. They now are doing a major job in trying to help people get back into the market for homeownership. Their funding source has been zeroed out. It's called the Neighborhood Reinvestment Corporation is what's been zeroed out. It's a line item in HUD out. You're going on your tour tomorrow, and Boston was the first city to actually get a Choice Neighborhoods. Sean talked about it last night, a Choice Neighborhoods grant. First one came to Boston in 2011, so you could actually see the outcome of that, but it's really the revitalization and redevelopment of distressed assisted housing, including a whole lot of neighborhood and commercial revitalization. The Quincy corridor, you can really see that. So big problems there. But when I left the administration, I moved to the Bipartisan Policy Center to continue working on both housing finance reform, which was my major responsibility at Treasury, and GSE reform at Treasury in the White House, and affordable housing. And one of the things that you do at the beginning of an administration, not knowing who's going to win, is you start thinking about what would a transition memo to the new administration look like? What would you like to recommend that they do and get it there early enough that maybe it would have some influence? So I started working on this rental proposal, 9 million more renters than we this decline in homeownership, the affordability squeeze, all of this. So I decided that really affordable rental policy should be both robust and one of the first things we kind of think about delivering. And to be honest with you, I was working from probably 4 months leading up to the election on this with the notion that the outcome of the election would be different than it turned out to be. And so I put together a pretty expansive proposal. And November 8th, I'm sitting down with our team at BPC, and we're saying, this is something maybe we want to not post yet. And do we want to kind of rethink what things are possible in a new Trump administration? And so we have a colleague under contract at BPC. I was Assistant Secretary for Policy Development and Research at HUD under Bill Clinton and Secretary Cisneros. And a guy that we work with, a guy named Dennis Shea, who's really fabulous, held that same position in the Bush administration. And so Dennis and I called Dennis, as I said, he's under contract with BPC. And I said, let's see if you and I, we both served in the same position. We both loved HUD. We both really loved their mission and so on. Can we find common ground? And I gave him what was really kind of a Clinton-esque proposal. And we spent probably 6 weeks kind of hammering it out and going back and forth. And it was posted on the BPC website a couple of weeks ago, Dennis Shea and me. And we really felt then, and even with the budget that came out, that there is a deal to be had. And Sean really began to talk about it last night. I mean, there are big, broad parts of the housing toolkit that really have been supported bipartisan for a long time. The low-income housing tax credit, as Scott just mentioned and Diane just mentioned, and one thing to know, by the way, when you eliminate the Home Investment Partnership Program and the Community Development Block Grant Program, but you love the tax credit, CDBG and home money provide what's called gap financing to tax credit developments. Everything is kind of interconnected here. So if you love the tax credit, but you got these other programs that are needed, it costs a lot to build new housing for very low-income people, and it's done through layered subsidies, complex, creative financing that allows you to target deeply because people can't pay the rent to support big mortgages. You need the tax credit and you need gap-filling financing that doesn't require being paid back in order to make these projects feasible. So these pieces kind of interact. But broad support for the low-income housing tax credit. Sean mentioned this last night. Incredible progress has been made in the homeless space. Going from what used to be called the continuum of care, you've got to deal with the alcohol, he mentioned this on the chronic homelessness, the notion of providing permanent housing for people who are addicted and with other problems, giving them permanent housing before you address these other problems made no sense until we started getting research results that show the importance of stability and a stable home where you can then deal with these other problems. And it's not just that the chronic homeless have been homeless a long time, they cycle in and out of homelessness and they go through the jail system and the medical system and cost an enormous amount. And when you compare that cost to the cost of an apartment where they can get treatment and stability, just this notion of housing first really has become a principle that has made enormous progress on the chronic homeless side. And so Dennis and I saw a big opportunity there to continue not only supporting the chronic homeless housing first programs, but also, and Chris mentioned Desmond, we are learning that temporary housing assistance, called rapid rehousing, 6 to 12 months of rental assistance to help stop an eviction. And if there's that first spell of homeless, that quick hit to get people back into a house, pay enormous dividends down the road. And so that we built into our set of proposals a significant increase in not only in supportive housing for the chronically homeless, but also for rapid rehousing and so on. And as you go down the list, let me just give you the top line. And I must say, I had a much bigger investment before the election outcome was known. But what Dennis and I did, it still requires more money. It's an $8.5 billion a year, 10-year, $85 billion. But for that investment, we could increase the supply of affordable rental homes by as much as 400,000 units over 10 years, reduce homelessness among families and chronic homelessness based on evidence-based programs to de minimis levels, provide, and this absolutely, Sean talked about this, Chris talked about, everybody talks about the research of Shetty and Larry Katz and so on, tracking really the profound benefits to young children who can move with a voucher and the right kind of support to find housing in high opportunity neighborhoods, where we now have tracked them over 20 years, and we see the significant increase in college attendance and income, and by the way, federal tax payments relative to what they would have been. And Dennis and I did not find a problem in recommending together 350,000 vouchers, what we call mobility vouchers. I would argue in the new administration we should call them opportunity vouchers. It's exactly what Secretary Carson would like to see, and that is help young people move into places of opportunity where they and their families can flourish. So we put together this proposal that we think could have strong bipartisan support. And if we were in an environment in which the new administration and the Congress really want to find common grounds in the affordable housing area. As Sean said last night, not strong divisions here. And there ought to be ways of overcoming it. But when you put out a budget plan that is so far here, it's awfully hard to get back to thinking about modest new investments. And that's what concerns me. It's not that we're actually going to see a zeroing out of CDBG and home and NeighborWorks and choice neighborhoods and all these things, but it's an awfully deep climb back up to think about modest cost of, effective investments through proven programs that benefit people both in the short and the long term. So that's kind of where I'll stop right now.
Great, thank you, Mike. Scott, since you went first, I want to give you a chance to respond. Let me see if I can frame a question for you. You mentioned in terms of Dr. Carson going around and trying to learn about what works, and so I wanted to invest in what works. Mike's laid out, what from where he sits at the VPC, he thinks ought to have bipartisan support. I think there's two things that Mike's pointing to. One is that they work. I mean, things about housing first has been proven to save money. The family options study that was done shows that getting, families at risk of homelessness into permanent housing saves money, because if you don't put them there, they go elsewhere in the system that's expensive. They end up in hospitals. So I think, and there's evidence around programs like Jobs Plus that you can get people who help in getting into the labor force, family self-sufficiency that work pays. So I think there is a lot of evidence that programs pay dividends. They're programs that ought to appeal to Dr. Carson's notion of having people help themselves.
Right.
Do you think that there's potential bipartisan support for those kind of initiatives?
I do, and I would say that. So a couple of things. I think when it comes to the homeless programs, I think that when we see the budget in full, I'm fairly certain that the homeless programs have not been touched. I think that Dr. Carson does believe in housing first. I will tell you that, not many years ago, the term for housing first by those who did not support it was bunks for drunks. I think that over the last 10 years, a lot of folks have done a lot of good work on showing that, this really does make sense and it really does work. And I think that's bipartisan. I think that, little other things that Senator Collins focuses on, that's youth homelessness. So there's a lot of focus on that area, and I do believe that there is certainly a bipartisan solution or bipartisan recipe that you can achieve. I also think that just for you reporters who are looking for the next story, what is the next kind of checkpoint? I think it is really masochism that the way this budget was rolled out, because where you do the top line, and then in 2 months, at the end of May, there will be the budget in full, you're going to go through this whole process again. So rather than just go ahead and just take your beating all at once for whatever it is you want to do, now we're going to do it twice. And so I think that's really tough. And then you're going to go out there and you're going to have hearings. You'll have budget hearings. You'll have the four corners. So you'll have appropriations hearings. You'll have authorizing hearings in both the House and the Senate to talk about these things. And so it's interesting. I think if you look at also, let me look at nominees like Perdue, right? Governor Perdue hasn't gone up yet. His hearing for Agriculture Secretary is going to be on March 23rd, right? That's going to be a lot of fun for him. He doesn't, this isn't anything he had to do with. So I think, what is the bipartisan solution? So it may surprise you that there are, and I won't name people, but there are Obama appointees and Obama secretaries that people would say are great housing advocates who actually propose zeroing out CDBG. And it's not that that they did not like the program, but it is a tactic that those who build HUD budgets use sometimes. I have negotiated many HUD budgets, and I have used many of the tactics. And there was a question last night that I wanted to address because somebody said, should we go out there as advocates and say, while you see these massive cuts, should we go out there and say, no, we don't want cuts. We want $6 billion more in this housing program. And what is the answer to that? I would say this, that not many years ago, probably more than I would like to really think about, when I basically bled over trying to get to $4.5 billion in CDBG and that number. And it was a fight. It was a hard fight. And the budget comes out at $4.5 billion in CDBG. And the mayors come out and say, we wanted $8 billion. And it is so demoralizing for those, and that's right. And I would tell you that if there was another year of President Obama, his budget this year, what we would look at, it would look like 16, which looks like 17, which would look like 18, with a couple of more dollars in tenant-based Section 8. There'd be a little bit of an inflation factor in there, but at the end of the day, it would be the same. It doesn't matter if you have a Democratic president or a Republican president. When it comes to the people in this room, and the topic we're talking about today, the housing budget is tough. It always, always is. So when you get to sort of that policy question, so how do we develop really good policy? Really good policy, if you could kind of have a clean sheet and say, what is that policy that we want to build? You can't get to that because we have so many external forces. And there is internecine battle between those who think home ownership is a great goal, those who think it should be rental. And we have, that's where we should put all of our effort. I can tell you back in the Bush administration, we got to 69.3%, I think, about that.
69.
Yeah, 69, better than 69, didn't quite make, always wanted to make it to 70, didn't quite get there, and then we had to collapse. And so I think that there is, and Chris makes a great point, I think this is what Dr. Carson will focus on, is trying to find, not necessarily home ownership as the greatest goal, but trying to help improve the situation or improve the universe so that minority home ownership, what are the barriers? Why do we have this problem? And how do we actually adequately address that? Trying to get to those rental policies. I think Dennis Shea was a great Assistant Secretary for Policy Development and Research. I wish he would come back. I think he's very happy doing what he's doing, and I think I don't think he wants to do that, but I think he would be great. So the work product that they're putting together, I think, is a great kind of marker also about what could be. But if we keep having, and look, Diane's right. I mean, Diane's not wrong, and she's highlighting all of these threats under this budget. I will sit back and tell you that they are threats, but they are not real threats. Some of them. I do think the Housing Trust Fund is something that you got to watch. If you believe in the Housing Trust Fund, I think that because of all of the different machinations which will come in GSE reform, which I do not expect to see this year, I think you will see some movement in the committees. I think the House will lead on GSE reform. I think Senator Crapo, being a new chairman of the Senate Banking Committee, is very focused on getting to that, but I think what he really wants to do is kick the tires on his new committee first and get to some low-hanging fruit, get to some things that are bipartisan in nature. Remember that he was a co-sponsor with Senator Johnson on a GSE reform bill that was kind of like the Kumbaya bill that everybody should love, and couldn't even get Senator Warren on it. So that's kind of that's the future for that. It's a nasty, ugly battle. And if you look at where the administration will lead, I think the administration, one of the things that, I'll say this, so Sean was good about trying to keep some things private between his conversation with Dr. Carson. But one of the things Sean said, and I think it was very, very important, and something that I think he learned the hard way, was focus your goals. I think Sean had about 17 really important goals. And the former staffers in here, if they're already, will say, man, that was too many. Because when you have 17 goals, the 17 priorities, you really have none. Because at these places, these agencies, it's very difficult to get 5. So, but when I think that the White House looks at this, their highest goal is growth in GDP. You look at Secretary Mnuchin, you look at Gary Cohen. These guys are serious human beings, and they are focused on that growth in GDP, and that's what's going to drive them. And so when you look at housing, you've got housers inside the West Wing. You've got real housers who really, Gary Cohen built D4 in Harlem, Dream Academy. You can look it up. They put a charter school in the basement, and he just will talk about the transformative nature of that exercise, that he was involved in, that something that he did, and feels very, very passionately about that. So I think that this budget, it's, if you ever wanted to know what a budget would look like if you gave the pen to a congressman from South Carolina who is the chairman of, or a leader in the Freedom Caucus, this is what it looks like. And Mick Mulvaney he is a bright, really smart guy. He's a good tactician. He had a lot of these budget issues wrapped up and done before people could blink. By the time that people really said, well, what's really going on, he was done. It was already done, and he's been doing this for years, and he really does believe that you need to roll back some of these expenditures. Diane's absolutely right. This is not about that $20 trillion debt, but that $20 trillion debt really is out there. That's a real number, and it's a big number. And we do as a nation need to think about how we do that. But every time you try to do something in housing, every time you try to move in one direction, you begin to break off your coalition because there's so many different beliefs out there. I think one thing that you do see right now is this place-based. You see mobility. I think towards the end of the Obama administration, you really did focus solely on mobility. I think in the beginning, back locally, there's a professor, I guess before the divorce, maybe with MIT. You probably had Zav here, but so Zav Briggs.
He was on both sides.
Yeah.
He was here first, and then he was there.
So Zav back to reporters and looking at who makes decisions. There is a role inside the Office of Management and Budget called the Political Associate Deputy. This is the PAD, the Political Associate Deputy. You have a director, you have a deputy director, and then you have PADs. PADs oversee what's called the Resource Management Office. Those are called the RMOs. The PAD who oversees housing, the housing RMO is called general government. So the general government has commerce. I won't go into it because I'll forget something, but I'm going to try. But that PAD, so Zav was the PAD. And you could really drive real policy from that PAD perspective. And Zav really believed in place-based strategies. And a lot of things, choice neighborhoods comes out of place-based. And that was kind of a growth from Hope 6. And I think that what Dr. Carson will say, I think the things that he'll look at is mobility is important, but back to what Chris said, you can't move everyone. You need to have a balanced approach. And I think there'll be the pendulum coming back towards a place-based strategy. And I can say that, and then when the budget goes out there and eliminates choice, which is truly a place-based strategy. So I think that there will be some, we're going to have to reconcile this budget. This budget does put a marker down. I think in many, as we've said before, it's not going to become law. So I think as you kind of get past that and you go forward and say, look, no matter who the president is, the HUD budget is always, always tough. Always tough. So let's get past the money. Let's figure out what are the policies that we should go out there and advocate for. And once we get to that policy kind of mixture, let's go out there and say, $85 million a year gets us here. Now let's go do that. $85 million this year, $850 over 10 years. That might be the goal that helps do this. Now the GAP is important too. So CDBG, home, GAP, they all provide GAP. But there's also new things. So the administration, and not just, it's not it began in Treasury. I think Mike was probably still there. But the FFB, the Federal Funds Bank, right? The Federal Financing Bank. That Federal Financing Bank, your state housing finance authorities, who Senator Crapo within 5 minutes of his first meeting with Dr. Carson, said, housing finance authorities are the way. You've got to really, really focus. You've got to get to know them, work with them, and because they are doing great things. That federal financing bank actually can lend directly to those housing finance authorities, and they can make loans to developers. They make money on the spread between the rate that they pay, which is what, 1% now, right? We just had an increase, about 1%, and then what they finally charge to the developer. It's usually, I don't know, I think HDC in New York is probably farther along than anybody. New York is its own microcosm of housing. They make so much money on that deal that they're putting their own money back into deals for GAAP. So it's a really cool way that you find other mechanisms to finance these activities and not rely on this, got to fight for home, got to fight for CDBG, got to fight for this little pot, got to fight for that little pot. And it's that sort of that busy work that keeps us from really getting to those policy calls that we want to. But look, again, Diane is absolutely right. We can't get to those policy issues if we don't have the money to actually.
Busy work? I mean, these little details like $6 billion in
which
cuts.
isn't going to happen.
Okay.
All right, so I do want to open it up. I did want to touch on one thing, so maybe I'll throw out a question quick. Maybe Mike, I'll throw it to you. We've talked a lot about rental housing policy. Haven't talked much about home ownership. Obviously, we went through a period of time of great pain. Scott said we got to 69% home ownership rate. A real open question whether that was, a problem in and of itself. We went too far. We could have a whole debate about that. But I think what is true is that we're not talking much about home ownership now. I think we're shied away from it because of the fact we went through so much pain. So I think the question maybe for you, Mike, is have we moved away too much from home ownership? And if we were to think about policies for home ownership, what are the ones that we really ought to be talking about that we're not?
Yeah. There are still, the results of the crisis are still really heavy among us. And we've had a lot of reforms to get rid of the bad features of mortgages. We have good guardrails. We'll see what the new administration wants to do as they talk about repealing, if you will, Dodd-Frank. I don't think you're going to see the repeal. There are good reforms that could be had that are probably causing some restrictions in credit, but we are still facing very significant tightness in credit for those who don't have the highest credit rating. And that is one of the most important activities that have to really focus on litigation. This one is a really important one because progressives don't want to be seen as being easy on banks, but the fear of litigation, if loans default, and the Department of Justice can come in and with treble damages under the the False Claims Act and so on, has really resulted in lenders afraid to move up the risk curve, where good loans can be had, but the probability that some of those loans are going to default is higher than if you're just giving loans out to those with the strongest credit. And there's a lot of work to be done at HUD and FHA in clarifying those rules and loans, because FHA with the 3.5% down payment are going to become increasingly important. So we've got to take care of that problem. There is a severe shortage of starter homes. Both, you're not seeing them built, but as importantly, that lower tier of inventory in communities for first-time homebuyers to buy is in very short supply. And if you're looking for local kind of stories, the question is kind of why in your communities is it so hard to find that inventory? And part of it is it's hard to build in that area. We get to Sean's area, and it's part of our rental brief, actually. It's how hard the regulatory permitting process, all of that kind of problem in communities makes it hard to build for that lower tier of the market. And if we don't break that, chain, remember, those people can't move out, right? If those people are not selling their homes to first time, then they can't move up and so on. And so we really have a continuing challenge. And Jack Kemp started the challenge of state and local land use barriers. President Obama spoke about it, but it's tough taking on mayors and on doing something about zoning and so on. And Clinton was going to do a carrot and sticks kind of approach, provide some grant incentives for communities to enable more homes to be built. You know, it was Nixon. It was not Nixon just going to China. Nixon tied the receipt of suburban water and sewer grants to doing something about affordable housing. I mean, that was the most and the tightest connection between a vital federal resource that communities, suburban communities wanted, and he said, you're not going to get it unless you open up your, now I don't know that we will see that again, but we've got to do something about how hard it is to build housing for first-time homebuyers and low and moderate income families.
Great. I do want to open.
To add on to that?
Okay, quickly, because I want to do
Sure.
get to the audience here.
Sure. So another way that we can work to incentivize home ownership is through changes to the mortgage interest deduction. So, we spend about $200 billion a year to help Americans buy and rent their homes, and 3/4 of that goes to subsidize higher income homeowners. We actually spent, 15% of the benefit of the mortgage interest deduction goes to the top 1% of earners. So we're actually spending every year as taxpayers $10.5 billion to subsidize the homes of some of the wealthiest people in the world. So it's not that we shouldn't subsidize or assist people to become homeowners, we should, but we're doing it wrong and we're subsidizing the wrong people. And there's some simple ways that we can change that so that we are assisting those marginal borrowers who couldn't otherwise become homeowners to become homeowners and save a lot of money in the process. And so a couple changes. One would be to lower the cap on the amount of a mortgage that you can deduct your interest on from its current level of $1 million down to $500,000. So if you have a $600,000 house, you have a $700,000, you still deduct your mortgage up to $500,000, the amount in your mortgage. So that change impacts fewer than 6% of homeowners, of mortgage holders across the country, and it saves $85 billion over 10 years. The other change is to shift from a deduction to a non-refundable capped credit worth a percentage of annual interest. That's the change that makes it possible for all those low-income mortgage holders who currently don't get any tax benefit from having a mortgage because they don't earn enough to itemize their deductions to get a tax benefit. So shifting from a deduction to a credit would mean that 15 million low and moderate income homeowners would get a new tax break, and another 10 million low and moderate income homeowners would get a deeper tax break. So the two changes together mean 25 million low and moderate income homeowners getting a tax break, incentivized to become homeowners, and we save $241 billion over 10 years that could be reinvested into rental housing solutions. So we could have a balance between homeownership and rental housing in this country.
Great. I do want to open it up, and I do think think about what we can really do to move the needle in this budget-constrained environment. The mortgage interest deduction has to be on the table, and if you think about the barriers to homeownership, the principal barrier to homeownership is not the monthly cost, it's the upfront down payment and closing costs. And so thinking about not just changing the deduction, but changing it into kind of more of a first-time buyer credit targeted by income. We talk about the high level of the mortgage interest deduction, what it's worth. If you do the average, it's not a lot of money. So if you talk about people under $50,000, only 2% get the credit. And those who get it, they get about $40 a month. So it's a lot of money, but it's a lot of money that's spread across 34 million taxpayers, and a lot of it goes to upper income people. So there ought to be a story that says the housing industry ought to care about redirecting this because it ought to help the housing industry. I talk too much. Tansy?
This is a question for Scott. Has Dr. Carson wrote an op-ed in the Washington Times a couple of years ago criticizing the HUD ruling for fair housing, calling it, I believe, social engineering. Has his thinking evolved on that at all?
I think he addressed this in committee. I think that when you talk about the affirmatively furthering fair housing rule, right, and actually this week, one of the primary authors of that rule was appointed to be the president of the Federal Reserve Bank down in Atlanta, right? So that's a guy named Raphael Bostic. And Raphael spent a lot. It was just, we reached out to him and wanted to brief Dr. Carson, really on what exactly the rule. What does it really say? Because there's a lot of ambiguity about this rule. And so Raphael spent a long time with Dr. Carson, really working through these issues. Now, Raphael is absolutely a fair housing warrior, and he has done a lot over his, very illustrious career to do this. But he said, look, there's a lot of disagreement inside the building about what this rule means. And there were vibrant fights inside the building. There were really strong disagreements on really how this rule should be implemented. And I think that, some would say this should be a tool to make sure that communities are doing exactly what Diane said, which is they're living up to their responsibilities to calculate this and understand, where they're creating affordable housing opportunities, and make sure that they are doing so in a manner that is consistent with the Fair Housing Act. But then there are also others who, and this is a mayor used this term, and I thought that was pretty good, who want to weaponize that rule and begin to decide for others where they should be and where they should not be. And I would point you to an African-American mayor in Houston who is really right now in full-scale battle with HUD on the fact that he wants to redevelop an area in his city that he grew up, wants to bring that promise to that community. That's his ward. And HUD has said, no, you can't do that. You can't do that because it's an area of concentrated poverty. So I think trying to find that balance. So when Dr. Carson spoke, that I think what he was saying was people trying to tell others where they should or should not live, or where they should not want to live, really. And you look at some of HUD's small area FMR rules, and saying that we're not going to subsidize you going in this area, but we'll give you money if you go in this area. I think those are all. That's right. But there is a debate. There is a debate on this.
No, but that's just wrong, Scott. I mean, the small area FMRs are about allowing people who want to live in. So fair housing at its core is about choice, right? And it's about low-income people being able to choose where to live and have that opportunity to have a genuine choice based on what's best for themselves and their families. Just like middle-income and higher-income people have that genuine choice. So related to the fair housing rule, there was ambiguity from 1968 until just a few years ago, when the Obama administration put some really clear definitions, some really clear guidelines, some maps, some tools to give to communities for them to use to take a look at within their communities, where are there disparities of access to opportunity? Where are there pockets of segregation? Where are there pockets of deep poverty? And then to ask themselves the question, how did they get there? What policies may have led to that, and what can they do to overcome that? There's nobody on high telling local communities where people should live and shouldn't live. This is about giving those low-income people themselves the opportunity to do that. And on the small area FMRs, the issue is that within the Section 8 voucher program, while it offers the promise of mobility, actually moving, a low-income person who has a voucher being able to move potentially to a higher-income neighborhood if they want to, there's some constraints on that based on how we set the worth of the voucher. And we do that through fair market rents that are set at a metro area. So if you think of a place like New York City, where within a metro area, there are hundreds of very different housing markets, right? So what HUD is working to do, and what we have started doing in some communities, are small area FMRs. That sets the worth of the voucher at a much smaller scale, so it's more reflective of those local markets. So somebody who has a Section 8 voucher, now the worth of that voucher is higher, and they can go to that higher income community where the rents are higher, and they can use their voucher to live there. They can also choose, if they want to stay in the community that they're in. So it's not about, I mean, that's a vast over.
But for less.
We only have 20 minutes left, so
Yeah,
we could
okay.
spend all
Yeah,
day on
we could,
AFH.
we
So, right.
I have 2 questions. Scott, first I wanted to see if you would clarify your remarks about Houston very briefly. Houston faces a Title VI violation for its distribution of fair housing, and Turner is specifically cited for refusing fair housing near the Galleria area, which is the Tony area. So if you could clarify what you mean about his use of AFFH, or his thinking on AFFH.
Sure. So, look, I don't work for the mayor. I would tell you, just I have some familiarity with the issue. I think the issue you're talking about is that the mayor did not agenda an item up to the city council for that area that you're talking about. So there was the housing authority has been trying to build affordable housing in a bunch of areas inside. HUD went into a negotiation with them about where they could actually site some of these things. I think that the per unit cost at that in the Galleria was, I think, $350,000 per unit. And the mayor said, gosh, you know what, we need to study this some more. And they didn't agenda the item. And so for that, a lot of the local advocate community, which they're very strong, went to HUD and said, look what he's doing, and they opened up that investigation. Now, he wants to deploy his resources, and I don't think, we can keep going on this, but there are areas that mayors and cities around America would like to redevelop. And when you move away from sort of these place-based strategies, HUD makes it very difficult for mayors to redevelop those areas now that we're looking at concentration of poverty as one of the determining factors about whether or not you can deploy HUD resources. So that means, when I go back to that, I mean, that's.
Although AFFH went out of its way to say that there was an opportunity to invest in distressed communities when it made sense. So it's not like they said you can't do that. So,
Supreme Court said it as well.
and
right.
so it's not, anyway. But what's your second question?
Okay, we're spending a lot of time talking about Trump's proposed budget for good reason, but that budget and tax reform both face really, really steep hikes in the Senate to be passed. But just the discussion of tax reform has had a significant effect on LIHTCs. I wonder whether you could comment a little bit about that, and maybe any other places, like, I don't know, CDFIs, or areas where just the discussion of big cuts to HUD is or may have an impact on the housing market.
Just on the CDFI issue, we've been focused on HUD, but essentially the budget that came out yesterday would zero out all non-statutory CDFI grant programs. So it's obviously it would be a severe hit there of getting capital into some of these capital-starved areas. I would not expect that to happen any more than the CDBG program to be wiped out, but again, it does presage significant cuts in CDFIs. So what you've got on the tax credit issue, it makes sense that if you go from a 35% tax rate to a 20, 25, 30, 25, 20, 15, where the president wants to go, the value of a tax credit, right, declines significantly to the investor. And so just the prospect of corporate tax reform is chilling, right, the market. Investors are not willing to sign on the dotted line for a tax credit whose value goes over a 10-year period, right,
Right.
is going to erode. And the committees know this. There has been broad bipartisan support. I mean, since the election, you have Cantwell and Hatch having introduced a bill to increase the low-income housing tax credit by 50%. I mean, it's broadly supported. Now they understand also what we're talking about, and there are efforts underway to deal with yield maintenance and so on. I'm reasonably, you can't be optimistic in this crazy environment, but it's an issue that they are seriously looking into. And therefore, I'm feeling like at least it's not going to get lost in the shuffle. There is a GSE issue associated with corporate tax reform that could roil things. Interestingly, again, since the GSEs have become profitable, they are using tax credits and tax shelters like other corporations. And if this rate goes down again from 35% to 25 or 20, and so on, the value of their tax shelter that they've already put on their books erodes. They will have to write down what's called the deferred tax assets, which could result in a treasury draw that Diane is talking about for a different reason. Again, it would be an accounting issue, not a credit risk issue, not because the GSEs, right, would be losing money because people are defaulting, but on an accounting basis. And that could trigger some political concern, and Treasury will have to address that. It's something we know may well happen, and so from a political standpoint, everybody should be educating their members to anticipate that if this happens, the sky isn't falling, but nevertheless, that is another area of tax reform that could be implicated, here, in addition to the MID kind of issue that Diane talks about. Yeah.
And I think the good news, real quick, the good news about the tax credit is that it is, as they would say, it is at the table and not on the menu, right? And so that is, as you go forward at looking what tax reform looks like, the concept is let's make sure that when this does happen, that LIHTC, we figure out how to make LIHTC continue to work.
Tim, and then we'll come over here.
Similar to the Boston Globe, it feels like for 10 years, probably since the housing crash, people in the housing world have been talking about reforming the mortgage interest deduction. But people in the world of selling homes, realtors and mortgage bankers, have managed to fight it off.
You got it.
Are we in a place now politically where that might actually start to change? Do you think anything will actually happen? Or will it just be another round of conversation around it and nothing changes?
I think it's the conversation has shifted, no doubt. I think, for decades, some have been talking about the need to reform the mortgage interest deduction, but in terms of policymakers willing to even consider it, it's been off the table. It's that third rail program that's untouchable. I think a couple of things that have happened to get us to this point today, where it's actively key members of Congress are considering actively changes to the mortgage interest deduction, whether direct or indirect. And that's partly, I think, because a lot of folks have been working on changing the conversation, probably more about because now we're in an environment where for the administration and Republicans in Congress, comprehensive tax reform is a top priority. Their main goal in doing that is to lower corporate tax rates, and to lower them to the degree that we're talking about, you have to look at all the tax expenditures. The mortgage interest deduction is one of the biggest ones. So, Paul Ryan, he's said before that it makes sense to lower the cap. He's put out in his Better Way plan, he left open a pretty wide window for the possibility of changes to the mortgage interest deduction. I've talked with Republican staff on the Ways and Means Committee and the Senate Finance Committee. They all assure that they're considering it. A few weeks ago, I did an op-ed with Mark Calabria, who was at the Cato Institute at the time, where we were talking about, there's a lot of things we may disagree on related to housing, but on the need for reforming the mortgage interest deduction and targeting resources towards those with the greatest need, we agree. And just a couple days after the op-ed was published, he went over to the White House to become the vice president's chief economist, and he's working on tax reform from that point. So for sure, it's being considered. Who knows? I have no idea if tax reform is actually going to happen, if the mortgage interest deduction is actually going to be reformed, but I would say that looking back in the last 30 years for both, it's never been more possible than right now.
Scott, do you agree?
I think, yes, I think it is a more nuanced answer, but I think she's absolutely right. It is under consideration. I think Secretary Mnuchin was clear and said it's not on their agenda at all.
I just interrupt for a second there, and just said that it was just 6 weeks before that he said with equal certainty that it was, so I'd say he's moving on.
Yeah, I agree. I don't disagree. But I would say that this is the larger question would be not whether or not MID is on the agenda, it's what will be done with the savings, right? And Diane has been an absolute warrior on this topic, and she's doing a great job. And she may actually do a really good job in getting it done. But will the programs that we care about in this room see any benefit from that? It may very well be that it just goes to either a pay for a tax reduction, or it becomes a pay for deficit or debt reduction. So I think but I think that Diane, again, I'm probably sure in her calculus, it's let's get it on the table, let's try to get there, and then, at some point you're going to need to get to 60 votes. And so maybe this is a way that you use that to get some of those votes.
I think capturing it. My read of your op-ed was that you said we should retarget it. Mark said we should have it.
Get rid of it. That's right.
You agreed on getting rid of it, but you didn't agree on where it went. But Mike, you wanted to.
We agree that they should be targeted. We agree that it should be targeted to lowest income people.
But you need 60 votes, and that's the beauty of it.
Just one other thing. On the personal income tax side, which is where this all happens, you're likely to see a significant increase in the standard deduction. And if that increase is as substantial as it could be, it renders the mortgage interest deduction kind of debate and implications, less significant. And for that reason, you'll notice that the National Association of Realtors has publicly stated their opposition to that very large kind of increase in the standard deduction, going so far as to say that that could be viewed as a direct attack on home ownership, which is rather extreme, since it would benefit most every household and taxpayer. But so a lot of those things, enter into the MID kind of issue.
I think there's an education issue here, I would say, for journalists, in the sense that people who itemize will say, okay, I itemize my deductions and I've got $17,000 in deduction, my mortgage interest is a big chunk of that, I'm getting a lot of value from that. But in fact, if you look at the difference between the standard deduction and what that is, and then their marginal tax rate, it works out to hundreds of dollars, not thousands of dollars. And I think there's a misunderstanding which creates support for the MID, and the realtors use in marketing why homeownership is so good. So I think there's an education issue there. Yes.
Yeah, the question is about home ownership as well. I feel like in this country, people pay attention, think this is important, but this is not that important. Some people are happily renting as well. This compared to China, where I come from, the real estate market has been robust in the past maybe decade. And the home ownership is above 90%, but everyone is crazy now, because every time when you're talking about, the bubbles is going to be burst, but it never happened. And every time when, during that time, a lot of people are sent to mental illness institute, literally, because they felt, I missed the boat, I should buy more. And so I'm just wondering, what have you done in this country to keep people from being insane?
I might answer that question to start, but I think one thing to bear in mind is that the United States homeownership right now is 63.5%. If you put us in the industrialized countries, that's not particularly high. And so, look, relative to Europe, Italy, France, Spain, England, all have higher homeownership rates. So the United States we're not particularly crazy about homeownership any more than other countries. The places that stand out that have low homeownership rate are Germany, Austria, and Switzerland. What do they have? Very strong tenant protections and rent control. You want to have rent control and eviction standards, maybe you can get the homeownership rate down. So I don't think we're that crazy about homeownership relative to the rest of the world, is what I would say. Did we get overzealous during the run-up and saying that homeownership was for everybody? Yes. Is it for everybody? No. It's full of risks. You want to make sure you have those risks managed and prepared for. But I don't know that the United States is necessarily different than the rest of the country. So I stepped out of my moderator role, but
I would agree. The emphasis these days for policy is sustainable homeownership.
Right.
If you talk about the insanity, if you will, the concern is really of somebody buying a home and can't sustain it. And so we are now looking at ways to help people be successful homeowners. And looking at that as a policy goal more than is there an optimal homeownership rate that we have to achieve? And we're certainly not going back to that way of setting policy.
Yeah, I think on that, and I think also an interesting question would be, what new products can FHA in particular develop to help home ownership, right? So it's not necessarily just changing that FICO score calculation, right? So I think there's been a lot of work on making sure that the borrowers that FHA is seeing today are able to be sustainable homeowners. But we have this, and I certainly do, this belief that 30-year mortgage is so important. What about 20? Maybe 20. What would it be like if we start really looking at what new products could FHA help develop? Now, there's certainly 20-year mortgages out there. They're not really pervasive, but maybe that's something to look at. So I think looking at homeownership, looking at different products, and looking at how government can actually help seed a new product offering to help that sustainable ownership that I think everybody really is trying to focus on.
And this is a bigger topic. I'll just throw out one thing that FHA should do is to expand their lending for shared equity home ownership models, where there's much more public subsidy to bring the house down to an affordable level, but that affordability is permanently residing with the house. That's something that allows home ownership to be safe, secure, and permanently affordable.
And then transferable. Right?
And transferable. Yes. One last question I think we have time for.
So
Anyway, say who you are and where you're from.
Simon Montlake with the Christian Science Monitor newspaper. It says here, The View from Washington. It's kind of extraordinary to me. The president is a real estate developer, and we've not heard of, I have no idea what he thinks about housing or any of these issues at all, and no one's even brought it up.
Well, I think the budget gives us a pretty clear idea about what he thinks about low-income housing.
Okay. Can anyone tell me if the president has any concrete ideas about, what does he think about housing and real estate? I mean, he made his fortune in that exact arena. So it just seems very odd to me, this. And I realize we're getting into the policy weeds. And
That's good.
I'll
take the...
You're probably the best shot of any of us.
Because I have no idea.
I think you look at, so first off, so the president made his money on real estate, but it's on the commercial side too. So right, there's a big difference on that. I would say though that there are many people inside the White House, and so there are many schools of thought. I think that one school of thought would have said early on, we should not make housing a component of the infrastructure package. I think that the houser side of the White House came back and said, no, we absolutely are, because it's transformative in nature and it is exactly what we want to do. I think that, so when you see Nick Mulvaney's, the transcript about his budget rollout, he affirmatively says infrastructure, housing will be a part of that infrastructure package. So I think that's critically important. Now, if I am wearing Diane's hat, I'm going to say, look, I'd rather see $1 at a program today than a promise of $1 in the future. So I think it's really important to continue to watch for what does happen and how that infrastructure package develops. And if it's a series of tax credits, then that doesn't necessarily help in some ways. But I think that when you look at Gary Cohen, right? Gary is a serious human being who has been a has used housing in its and seen how it can be transformative. So again, look at that Dream Academy, look at Harlem, look at what they've done. I think you look at Jared Kushner. Jared's got a handful of D4s, right? So he knows exactly. Now, I think what they would say is, man, it was tough. It was really hard to get through this process because you have all these, if you use the HUD products, they're all very difficult, labor-intensive, 9-month processes to create affordable housing. So I think that you have right now folks who are driven by one overarching narrative, as what I said before, 3.5 or better % GDP growth.
Not going to happen.
Look, I hear you.
So
I know. Well, at least you see the adults in the room, right? You see the adults in the room when there were some early on saying, we're going to get to 5. We're going to get to 5. We'll get to 5 next month. And I think you see folks like, Gary Cohen and Secretary Mnuchin come in and say, no, come on. So let's get there. Let's have these pro-growth policies. And I think that's really what's driving them. And so I don't think that they all absolutely understand housing. They understand how to finance complicated deals. And I think that over time you will begin to see that pivot to that. But I think that is not what is driving right now, which is the driving force right now is going to be the healthcare reform. It is going to be tax reform. And those are the things that they are solely focused on.
Well, sadly, we're out of time. There are things that I had on my list to cover that we didn't get to. I think we'll hopefully be able to pick them up in some of the next panels. I think one of the questions that we'd hope to touch on was the way in which federal policy intersects with state and local policy. Mike touched on that, I think. How do you get the federal government to incentivize state and local levels to do the things that are necessary? Because I think the conversation ultimately comes back a lot to the cost of housing and what does it take to build housing, and that's the state and local level, not a federal level. Lots of ways in which we need to think about it, and hopefully the next panel can bring us back when they talk about the view from the local level. The other issue that we wanted to touch upon, we got into a little bit, is the question about how these housing issues intersect with other policy issues. And so, you mentioned all the ways in which you need to talk about these other cabinet secretaries. You did mention health, by the way, but it's obviously a huge one, intersection between health and housing. And how do we think about the intersection between those? So hopefully that'll get picked up in the later panels as well. The other big question, and I think that maybe this will be the kind of conversation we have over the coffee and lunch, is we're all here because we care about housing. A lot of you are here in housing beats. Sean mentioned last night, I think, and you mentioned today about CDBG. What's mentioned is Meals on Wheels. Why isn't housing more preeminent in the issues that are in people's consciousness? And and again, it goes back fundamentally to where you live and what's home. And if you can't pay the rent, you can't eat. And yet, we can't tell those stories in a way that seems to resonate and get these things up the policy agenda. So we need your help. We're obviously not doing something right if we're not getting that message out. And so I think part of the conversation I hope we had today is how do we distill what are these messages and how do we make them salient? Because we're all here because we think they're fundamentally important. And we hope you're here because you think they're fundamentally important and hope we can work together because I think making sure people have a decent, affordable home in a suitable living environment is fundamental to being a successful country, and we're not there. So join me in thanking the panel. I think it was terrific to have you all here.